Hey everyone, my name is Leanne and today I'm going to be bringing you part one of my July wrap-up. You're going to be seeing a lot of wrap-ups from me because obviously I'm going to be doing part two of this, and by the time that goes up it'll probably be time for my booktubeathon wrap-up. But I read a lot of books in July. I think I read something like 19 books. I don't know how I managed to read so much. I mean, I do. I'm unemployed, so that's how I managed to read so much. In this video, I am going to be talking about the children's and YA books, as well as the poetry that I read in July. So I'm just going to get into it. The first book I'm going to talk about is Iggy's House by Judy Blume. I didn't know anything about this book going into it, and part of me thinks if I did know something about it going into it, I may not have picked it up. It hasn't discouraged me from picking up any of Judy Blume's other books. I really enjoyed how it was written, but I just don't think the subject matter was something that I necessarily needed to read about. Now, when I tell you what it's about, just bear with me. So this is told from the perspective of a little girl named Winnie, who would like to befriend her new neighbours. Now, her new neighbours are a black family, an African-American family, and their arrival in the town is met with a lot of divided opinions and tension. Winnie has the very best intentions in befriending the children of this family. Because of the prejudiced environment in which she has been raised and what she has seen of African Americans in the media, she ends up committing a lot of microaggressions and asking a lot of really offensive questions. We can see that Winnie does have the best intentions. She doesn't really see that she's doing anything wrong. But there was a lot about this story that really rubbed me up the wrong way because it was kind of like, hey, Winnie might not be perfect, but at least she doesn't want to kick you out of the town. It had a lot of white savior complex tones to it. I do think this book could be used as a great way to prompt discussions with children about racism, but white children. This is a book written by a white person for white people. I just think if you want to learn about childhood African-American experiences, then maybe pick up a book by an African-American writer. This month I also picked up a children's picture book, and it was about Harriet Tubman. This book is part of the Little People Big Dreams series, which are all picture books about influential and important women throughout history, and it tells the reader a little bit about their life. I've read a few other books from this series before, but I think this was one that left the most impact on me. Harriet Tubman is most well known for escaping a slave plantation and repeatedly going on, I suppose, rescue missions to help other slaves escape. I think this book did a fantastic job of presenting difficult subject matter in a way that was easy for a child to understand, but without kind of sugarcoating it in any way. Like with all of the books that I've read from this series, I ended up learning a lot from it, even though it was a children's picture book. There was lots of information included in this book that I wasn't aware of. Even little things that seem so obvious once you find them out, like Harriet Tubman's name wasn't originally Harriet Tubman. I would highly recommend this for a child in your life, but, you know, also for yourself. The next book I'm going to tell you guys about is A Place Called Perfect by Helen and Duggan, and I really enjoyed this book. This is about what happens when a little girl moves to the town called Perfect, where a lot of strange things happen. Her family have moved to this town because it is her father's job to fix the eye problems that are going on in this town. Everyone needs to start wearing glasses to prevent them from going blind, but there seems to be a lot more to these glasses than originally meets the eye. Everyone in this town behaves perfectly, and Violet, our protagonist, really notices when her mother begins to change. Her mother kind of ends up being a stereotypical, like, perfect little housewife. Like, she really enjoys baking and cooking, and she goes off to her book club, which, you know, are fine, but Violet just realizes that this is uncharacteristic of her mother. Violet meets Boy, yes, his name is Boy, and together they begin to unravel what exactly is going on in this very strange but perfect town. I really enjoyed this book, and the way I have been describing it is if the whimsy and tea iconography of the Alice novels by Lewis Carroll and the strangeness of a Tim Burton film and the writing style of a Roald Dahl novel and the kind of like aren't all of the adults so foolish ideas of a series of unfortunate events were all smushed into one lovely novel, then you would end up with this one. I thought it was fantastic, I thought it was charming, and yeah, would highly recommend. The next novel I'm going to talk about is The Surface Breaks by Louise O'Neill. Now, I buddy read this with my very good friend Aoife over at Fred Weasley Died Laughing, and we were very pleasantly surprised by this book. I went on such a journey with my expectations of this book because when I first found out it was being written, I was so excited. Like, a Little Mermaid retelling by my favourite author sounds perfect. But then a lot of bad reviews started to come out of it, and suddenly I was very, very scared. Essentially, this is a feminist retelling of The Little Mermaid, and I think it is exactly what it says on the tin. The feminism is quite heavy-handed. Like, at points it feels like there's a big flashing light where it's like, I'm making a point here. All of the characters in this book are not very nice. I don't think that's a criticism whatsoever. Have you met people? I don't think this was Louise's best writing. It felt far less nuanced and it felt a lot more heavy-handed than her previous novels have. And I think it is quite clear that this is something she was approached and asked if she would write, rather than something that came, I suppose, more organically. Like, the brief was, write a feminist retelling of The Little Mermaid. It's exactly what I would expect. Although I think I would have personally enjoyed it a bit more if the feminism in it was less, look at all these horrible things that happen because of the patriarchy, had a bit more of emphasis on female friendship and female empowerment. Some of that is in there, definitely, but I think characters like the Sea Witch could have had a lot more done with them. I really liked this book. It's not a favourite, but I really enjoyed the reading experience of it. The final of the children's/YA books that I'm going to be talking about is I Was Born for This by Alice Osmond. This is a YA book that I was really pleasantly surprised about. So in this book we have two alternating perspectives, the first of which comes from a teenage girl named Angel. Totally almost forgot what her name was then. The book opens with her going to meet up with one of her online friends, and they are going to a meet and greet with their favourite boy band. The other perspective in this novel is from the lead singer of that boy band. We follow their journeys separately until their stories begin to intertwine, and I thought there were a lot of really interesting subject matters tackled in this book. We look at that kind of obsessive One Direction fandom that exists, but in a far more nuanced way than I've ever seen before. Yes, there are the crazy obsessive fans, but for a lot of people who are in these fandoms, it's far less about worshipping these attractive young men, but so much more about the community that is formed between the fans, and often those fans are young women. On the flip side of that, we see the damage that this level of obsession can cause for the people who are obsessed over. We see Jimmy constantly worrying about the danger that he is putting himself in. Every time he has an interaction with a fan, we see him suffer from panic attacks, and that was an element of the book that I really enjoyed reading about because it validated a lot of things that I've gone through in my life. I found his experiences of panic attacks to be very similar to my own. There's a lot of really great representation in this book as well. Jimmy is transgender and Angel is a hijabi Muslim girl, and there are just little bits of representation seamlessly woven into this novel. I did find the ending a little bit weird, and if you've read this book, you'll know what I'm talking about. Like, the dramatic thing that happens at the end, it did feel a little bit abrupt. Like, it felt like there just kind of had to be a big event that was gonna lead to the closing of the novel. But in saying that, I still think it was a really fantastic book. It was a really valuable look at a lot of different things that I hadn't fully considered before when thinking about the idea of fandom. Now onto the 4 poetry collections that I read this month. The first of which, and my favourite poetry collection that I've read so far this year, is A Recipe for Sorcery by Vanessa Kisuul. This poetry collection looks at the complexity of womanhood, and in particular, if you are a woman of colour, the added complications to that. The cacophony of female experiences, from the heartbreaking to the angering to the very amusing. I think this collection is explosive, and it's definitely the kind of poetry that is very up my street. The poet really takes no prisoners, both in terms of subject matter and language used. Some of the poems I enjoyed in particular included Whore, which is sort of about the worshipping of Martin Luther King Jr., while trying to acknowledge the fact that he had a number of affairs. And this poem comes from the perspective of his mistress. I really enjoyed the poem Cunnilingus because of course I would, and on a similar theme I really enjoyed the poem Not Worth Shaving Your Arsehole For. On the back of this book there is a quote from Holly McNish, and I'm kind of just going to echo that with my opinions, in that I know I love a poetry collection when I end up being like, oh, I wish I had written this. I wish I had come up with this idea for a poem. This is phenomenal and you should definitely read it. Published by the same publishing house, Burning Eye Books, I also read Jam is for Girls by Shagufta K. Iqbal. This is a debut collection and it is kind of like startlingly honest. It details the immigrant experience, but particularly the female immigrant experience, and what it is like to be a second or third generation immigrant. It's about her experiences of Islamophobia and racism, and there's a fantastic balance of ignited passion but also a tenderness in these poems. There's some really rich and vivid imagery in this one as well, and some of my favourite poems were Empire, I Bought Cacti, Medusa's Rage, and The In-Between. Highly recommend this one as well. This month I also read Honeybee by Tristan Mater, and this was a collection that I went into blind. I realised that I had an eARC copy of it and I just fancied reading a bit of poetry and I didn't really know what it was about. Oh boy, did this leave a little bit of an impact on me. This is quite a confessional, memoir-esque collection of poetry. It's breakup poetry. That's essentially what it is. And even if you haven't experienced a breakup in the same way as this poet, for instance, they were the one that walked away from the relationship that they're talking about, I think a lot of the feelings expressed in this collection will still resonate with you. Similarly, the poet was in a relationship with another woman. Even if that's not your particular experience, I still think the feelings are universal and the feelings will still resonate with you. This poetry collection made me feel a lot of stuff. And the final poetry collection I read this month, and the final book I'm going to talk about in this wrap-up, was Still Can't Do My Daughter's Hair by William Evans. This is another profoundly personal poetry collection, and it is focused on the writer's experiences as growing up as a black man in America. There's also an emphasis on his relationship with his daughter and how that has impacted his life. There's also an emphasis in this collection on how black men in particular, but men generally, have a pressure to perform masculinity. And we see the poet also looking back on how he has treated women in the past and wondering how he would feel if his daughter was treated the way those women were treated. It's a really powerful collection of poetry, one that I would really highly recommend, and I would also recommend you look up William Evans on YouTube because he's a fantastic performance poet as well. So they are all the books that I'm going to talk about today. Do let me know down below if you've read any of these and what you thought of them. In part 2 of this wrap up I will be talking about the adult fiction and the non-fiction that I read in July, so you've got that to look forward to. I hope you guys are having a wonderful day and I will talk to you in a few days' time.